All right, everybody, welcome to the next unit. So this is Unit 3 for World Geography. And Unit 3 is all about culture and everything that makes up culture, what happens when cultures collide or integrate or, just everything related to the cultural environment. So just real quick, let's start off with the definition, then we'll get into a couple of the other little parts. So when we talk about culture, it really is just the behaviors and the actions and the beliefs and objects that are a part of culture. Uh, and again, like we talked about in class, there's this visible culture, and we'll call that the cultural landscape. When you look around and you say, okay, what does this place look like, and how does this kind of reflect the culture of the people that are here? That's one part. And then we have this invisible force of culture, and that would be like the shared belief system, any kind of customs or traditions that people have that you might not readily be able to see visually, but that are definitely there. All right. And so when we combine these two things, the visible and the invisible, we end up with what we call cultural traits. All right. And those are things that kind of the individual things that build up what a culture is. And so it might look at food preferences or architecture, how people use land. And so it's those individual parts, so the cultural traits are those individual parts that combine and build up what a culture is. All righty. So we did this in class, but getting into culture, I want to talk about a couple of broad themes first. And looking at this, is this okay? And in class, we talked about the two concepts of cultural relativism and ethnocentrism. And so, when we get to cultural relativism, this is the reserving judgment on another culture based on where you're from. Okay, and so is it okay to judge another culture based on our own? And cultural relativism would say no. And so you can kind of see this cartoon here. It says these two guys being boiled in a pot. Cultural relativism, Perkins, makes our current situation no more agreeable. Meaning, they're saying, look, this is their culture. They're going to burn people in pots, but that doesn't really help. Okay, so you get the idea. So and this gets into it more. When we look at issues of human rights, if you look around the world and you see where human rights might be violated, is it okay to say that that's wrong based on some fundamental set of human rights? Something like women's education around the world. If a culture believes that women should only be educated up to a certain level, can we sit back and say that's wrong? All right, because cultural relativism would say, look, this is part of their culture, this is the tradition. Uh, who are you to judge? Whereas something like ethnocentrism is looking at a culture and judging it based on your own cultural beliefs. And so something like women's education, from an American standpoint, we would look at it and say everybody in the world deserves to have a right to an education, regardless of what your past cultural practices are. All right. And so you can kind of see this. This would be an example. So ethnocentrism again is judging things based on your culture, and it can definitely come across as very negative to say, "Hey, ours is superior to yours." That is, uh, you know, it's a bold statement because we have problems with our culture. Other groups have problems with theirs, but are there certain things that you can judge and say, okay, that's just wrong, regardless of the culture? All right. So this is this political cartoon here is interesting because it kind of brings this idea of ethnocentrism into play. You have two women clothed very differently, obviously, and the one in the bathing suit here is saying, "Look at look at her. She is everything's covered but her eyes. What a male, cruel, dominated culture." And then this woman over here who's looking at her saying, "Wow, she's hardly wearing anything. What a male dominated culture." And so that would be an idea of ethnocentrism. I did want to come back to this. We were talking about cultural relativism. This gets into not just like an American culture, but this gets into things like laws within. And so, just real quick, there was a Supreme Court case. This is the lower court case, but the Supreme Court case came about because there was a child who got sick, and parents said, uh, we believe that God will take care of the child, and we're not going to take him to the doctor. And so the question is, if there is a sick child, a very sick child, we're not talking about like a cold, but if there's a very sick child, is it the right of the practicing religion, the people practicing the religion, to say we're not going to take our child to the doctor? Or can we look at that and say, look, we appreciate the culture of your religion and the practices of your religion, but that's wrong, you know? And so uh, the case came out to where the Supreme Court ruled uh, that the parents had to take the child to the doctor, and that is because the child was not of the age uh, 18 to where they could make that decision for themselves. Because if you get sick and you don't want to go to the doctor, you don't have to. But if there's a child that gets sick and the parents refuse to take the child to the doctor, that's considered child endangerment. Okay, and so again, it's this mix of, you know, what are okay cultural practices, and is there a point that you can cross the line to say, okay, that's not a good cultural practice? Okay, so it gets a little tough. Uh, this is one we'll look at in class. This is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This came out after World War II, and it says things like people deserve an education, people deserve freedom of religion, those kinds of things. And we'll look at it more later. But the fact that this document goes against a lot of cultural norms across the world, and especially, you know, right after World War II, and it was written by primarily Western powers, meaning the U.S. had a large influence on this. Is this document written from an ethnocentric standpoint? And furthermore, is this okay to use these kinds of judgments on other groups of people? All right, so that's one we'll look at in class. Another big kind of overarching thing here is this idea of centrifugal or centripetal forces. So you can kind of see down here in this diagram. So if we're talking about a centrifugal force, these are forces that compel people to go away from something. It can break people apart. All right. Whereas centripetal forces are things that can bring people together. And so as we go through the culture unit, I want you to be thinking of is this a centrifugal or centripetal force? It's a lot like migration, you know, with the push and pull factors, very similar. And so just kind of keep these in the back of your head. So when we look at centrifugal forces, obviously there's a whole bunch of them, but these are four that kind of stand out. You know, these are things that divide a group of people. So centrifugal force is something that would serve to divide a group of people. So something like ethnic discrimination, political unrest or division, human rights issues, economic inequality. These are all things that may have an impact to divide people. And, you know, living here in the US, do we have these issues? Yeah, we got them all. A lot of countries do. Most countries do to some level. And so, you know, I mean, political unrest, hello, 2020. So anyway, so those are centrifugal forces, forces that push us apart. This would be a picture of a homeless camp. And you can see, you know, there's an interesting, and we'll be doing things with pictures to try and get a read of what the places are like. But you can see in the background here, here's a stadium, you know, and so these stadiums are, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars, and these are homeless people camped out, you know, and this is showing a pretty impressive level of income inequality just based on this picture. Okay, there's a lot more that goes into this, but so anyway, so you know, when we start looking at pictures and analyzing, we can kind of get a context for what some aspects of the culture. All righty. Now we also have centripetal forces. Again, those are things that pull people together. So things like a common language, things like the strong sense of nationalism, American pride, Russian pride, Brazilian pride, whatever it is. So strong sense of nationalism, pride in any kind of national team, Olympic team, things like that, or any kind of ethnic or religious homogeneity. All right, that means homogeneity means everybody's very similar. And so if you have a culture that just practices primarily one religion, that would be a centripetal force. All right. So this is an example of a centripetal force in the U.S. This is the women's soccer team winning the Olympic Games. And so, and this one actually might be the World Cup. I apologize, but you get the idea. Uh, this would elevates American pride, and that's a centripetal force. All right, so we did that. Cultural patterns and processes. This is the unit that we're working on. And again, these are the visible forces up here. Whoops, visible forces, and then the invisible forces down here. All righty. So when we look at culture, we'll start off with an example. This is from the Lakota tribe in the United States. And so before Europeans and later the America, when what became America, came in, the Lakota people used the buffalo as a large part of their culture. Okay, it was clothing, it was shelter, it was food, it was they used it a lot. That was part of their culture. And then uh, then later, when Americans came in and started to kill off all the buffalo, almost drove them to extinction, that had a severe impact on the culture of the Lakota people. And so, this is the combining of when two cultures clash. It can produce very negative results, or sometimes it can produce very positive results. It depends on how those interactions are. But anyway, so you can kind of see this just gives an example of the idea that one culture can be unique in and of itself, and then another culture can come in, and when those interactions happen, that's when things can either go terribly wrong, or sometimes they can go pretty right. All right. So all right, so just a basic definition here when we were analyzing culture. And again, you can kind of look at different pictures and get a sense for what those places are like. This is showing lots of buildings, so this would show economic power, things like that. And so you can see down here, dancing, this is the cultural stuff. But culture includes the learned behaviors, actions, beliefs, and so we talked about the visible stuff. All right. Uh, Culture is also the invisible force. And so, again, like we were talking about, when you put these two together, you end up with cultural traits. All right. Now, one thing that we can kind of start to look at is this term called cultural complex. Cultural complex just says that uh, one object can have multiple traits of a culture. All right. And so when you look at a car, in the US, so let's say you get your first car. So when we talk about a car, what are some different things that can come about that would uh, allow you to read into what the culture of a place might be like? And so, does a car provide any social status? Does it show wealth? Is there an age element there? Are cars entertainment? Okay, uh, definitely possible. Is it a rite of passage? You know, things wrong there. The Sweet 16, if you get a car when you're 16, uh, does it represent a midlife crisis? If I were to go out and get a sports car today, people might look at me and say, "Hey, you okay? You seem to be having a problem." But it also represents, freedom and independence and self-reliance, and that's very much a part of the culture of the United States. So, but that's the idea. So when we talk about a cultural complex, we can look at one artifact, one thing, and start to read into, what that might say about a group of people. All righty. So when we are looking at culture, we want to figure out how that gets passed from one generation to the next. And so generally, children learn in three basic ways. So this is how we might pass our culture on to our children. First, we have imitation. All right, and so language, we repeat sounds back and forth to each other. And so a parent would keep repeating certain sounds, and that's how that would be passed on to the child. There's informal instruction. If a parent reminds the child to say please, something like that. Yes, sir, and yes, ma'am. That's really big in the South. Whatever it is within that culture, parents will try to correct and guide as you go forward. And then we also have formal instructions. We teach history in school, and that is definitely a strong way to pass on the cultural traditions of a country. All right. Uh, so, so another origin of culture. So one of the other terms here is a cultural hearth. All right. So cultural hearth is the area where a specific cultural trait develops. All right. And so if we're talking about democracy, then Greece, so this was our first one, Greece is the cultural hearth for democracy because that's where it started. Now, clearly, those things can expand out, obviously, but the hearth is where an original cultural trait starts. All right, New York City would be a cultural uh, hearth for rap music, and there's a bunch of other ones out there. So geographers study how cultures develop in hearths and then how they diffuse. And so this is another concept we'll be talking about, diffusion, and that is, you know, how do those aspects spread uh, across the city, across the state, across the country, or across the world. And obviously, as we know, it's gotten a lot easier today because of the technology. All right, let's see if I can fix my. That's not helping at all. Sorry. So when we look at culture, so these are just some of the things that make up those individual cultural traits that make up an overall culture. So obviously, language, history, food and shelter, the type of food, the type of shelter that people have, education systems, how groups are educated, security and protection, relationships, political, social organizations, religion, creative expression, healthcare. I would also argue would be, you could make that a number 10. But, and so this is the idea that when we start to look at a place, these are kind of the big bullet points that we would look at, and then we can kind of drill down on each of these, to see more more fine-tuned examples. But anyway, so this is just kind of, again, the big picture. And when we look at culture, we do notice across the world that there are these shared practices. We all have different ways of doing it, but the fact that we all do them says something about us as a species. Okay, we do generally have some type of rituals that go along with birth. We have definitely rituals that go along with death, the different ways that people bury people, the different ways that people either celebrate uh, or grieve, the passing of a person. Weddings are definitely a cultural thing, and then education, how we educate. And so, again, these are all things that all different cultures do, and so we all have these things in common. We just take different spins on it. All right. And the other big kind of picture thought that I want to make sure you keep in the back of your head when we start analyzing stuff is that a lot of these cultures, and we talked about this earlier on in the class, the environment that people are in does have an impact on their culture. Okay, that's relatively a pretty straightforward statement. And so if you look at things that might be scarce in the environment for a place, you start to see cultural practices that reflect that scarcity. If you see things that are plentiful, you start to see cultural practices that reflect uh, how plentiful something is. And so we'll see examples of this kind of as we go. Now, within culture, there are also taboos. Okay, a taboo is something that is heavily, heavily discouraged in a culture, and this could get to eating certain foods. In the U.S., we have a certain diet that generally we're okay with, and then there's some things that we might be grossed out by. Now, that's just a cultural taboo. That doesn't mean you can't do it. We eat chickens and we eat cows and we eat pigs and we eat a lot of things, but what about your dog? We're not going to eat Fluffy because that's just kind of taboo. And so you get the idea. And that's more of a lighthearted one, but there are also other taboos uh, that are much more serious. Okay. And so you can see things like if you go back, 100 years, uh, then if you looked at multicultural uh, marriages, marriages between a white person and a black person, that was illegal for a long time until the 1960s, when 1960s, that's not that long ago, when the Supreme Court ruled in a case in the U.S. that was completely legal. And so when we look at taboos can change over time because attitudes change over time. But and so you can see here also when a Catholic marries a non-Catholic, that used to be very much taboo. The mixing of religions used to be a very big taboo, but it's not so much anymore. People's perceptions change. Alrighty. Now we want to take a look, at where these cultures come from, and what causes cultures to stay similar and what causes some cultures to change. And so we're going to break this off into two different types. We're going to look at this thing called a folk culture. And so you can see this is the Amish in Pennsylvania. And so, folk cultures are the traditional cultures. We'll just leave it at that. I mean, we're going to define it a lot more in just a second. So folk culture is, what has always been. It's the tradition. Things don't change in folk cultures very, very fast. All right. And then we also have combined that with pop culture. And so let's see. If you have pop culture, this is kind of the culture of the day. It's very fluid. It's very fast changing. And so let's take a look real quick at folk culture and what that is. So obviously, small homogenous groups of people live in rural areas. Generally, the bigger the city, the faster the culture might change. The more willing it might be to change. And they are generally relatively isolated. They kind of stay to themselves, and that helps allow them to maintain that culture. There are a lot of different ways that folk cultures deal with, their physical environment. All right, and so you can kind of see that. There's a couple more. So popular culture and folk culture. So popular culture obviously represents the new, whereas folk culture represents tradition. Alrighty. And so you can kind of see here, this would be an example of pop culture. And this, I mean, a tractor is not exactly pop culture, but you get the idea. This is somebody farming using horse and plow, whereas this person's using a tractor. So this is keeping with tradition, and this is moving on, going with what's new. Alrighty. So this is an example in Brazil, and this brings up some ethical questions, just more for this group. But as the population starts to expand into the interior of the rainforest, there are these isolated tribes that don't have much contact at all with the outside world. And so there was a great documentary I saw. How much contact should groups that haven't had any? Should we try to keep them isolated, or should we try to engage them? And that's a tough question, because if we engage, that folk culture is gone, right? But here's the flip side of it, and this is what one of the people were arguing who started to engage with these people, and that is, think of all of the modern benefits that we have in terms of medicine, for one thing, electricity, all these things we take for granted now. Should we, by isolating groups, by keeping these groups isolated, is that better for them, or does it just make us feel good that we're keeping them isolated? Would they prefer to have access to all of the technology that we have today? It's an interesting question. Not a right answer to it, but it's an interesting question. Alrighty. So a couple things comparing pop and folk culture. So with society, I'm not going to read every single one of these, but you'll get the idea pretty quick. So with society, rural and isolated, very urban. Homogeneous, so they're very similar and diverse. So, just look at some of the keywords here. Indigenous or ethnic local languages, and these are modern languages. All right. Social structure, emphasis on the community and conformity. All right. And over here with pop culture, very much individualism. Sorry, I'm not sure what's happening to my writing pad here. Well-defined gender roles in folk culture. Gender roles can change in pop culture. With diffusion, and again, diffusion is the spread of things, it is relatively slow, and with pop culture, it is pretty quick. A viral video would be an example. It is often hierarchical, the diffusion is, the spread of it, meaning it comes from the top and spreads out. So some of the buildings and houses, material produced locally, and again, this is just all traditional stuff. This is tradition, and this is the new. All right. And so if you kind of stick with these two thoughts, then you should be good with figuring out, how they interact. So with food, locally produced, limited by tradition. Here, food is imported, wide diversity. Uh, yeah. All right. So one of the last things here is when we talk about culture, uh, and especially with folk cultures, there is very much a sense of place. All right. So if you think about, put yourself down in different parts of the world, what is that sense of place, right? Because that sense of place is the thing that ties a group to an area. I can tell you, growing up, I had a grandmother who lived in South Carolina, and she was lived out in the country, 100-acre farm, and I would go there, and there was very much a sense of place, and I still feel it today. That there's something there. It was the fields and the tree, I mean everything that was there. And so, when you think of Tucson, what's the sense of place of Tucson? If you look around, those things that you see and those things that you feel and those connections that you feel, that's what creates the sense of place. It could be the food, it could be the people, some combination of all of them, could be the natural environment. But all those things give an area a sense of place. All righty. So we'll stop this video, and then because I want to break these up a little bit, and then we'll come back into this one. All right. Okay, I lied. We'll just pause it whenever you like, but why make three when you can just do one? So anyway, so now we want to look at this idea of spatial dimensions of culture, where those cultures are, and how cultures use spatial, how we might look at a spatial analysis. And so when we look at culture, this Wilbur Zielinski, who's a geographer, divided the U.S. into 12 major cultural regions. And so again, these are perceptual regions. And if you recall back to the beginning of the year, perceptual region is just what we think of. Okay, it doesn't have any well-defined borders. It's just people's perception of what it is. And so he kind of broke the U.S. up into 12 different perceptual regions. So you can kind of see here, and these are definitely arguable. Here we are down in Tucson, so he would definitely put us in the Southwest. But what about Phoenix, which is up here? Sorry, or then we get up into Flagstaff. So actually Tucson's there, maybe Phoenix there, but doesn't matter. You get the idea. So he would say, look, here's the South, here's the Midwest. And so, when we talk about perceptual regions or cultural regions, this is kind of what we're looking at. Alrighty. And again, I'm just going to run through these real quick because we had these earlier. Formal region. This is a region where people share a common characteristic. And this could be, it could be the borders of a state, could be the borders of a country, it could be a common language, could be a common environment, it could be common anything. Okay, and so when we talk about formal regions, this is kind of what we're looking at. All right, the state of Montana is a formal region. The state of Arizona is a formal region. All right, functional region. This is an area organized around a node or a focal point. And so this is the TV station. So remember, this area, wherever the TV reception is, that is the functional region of the area. All right. Again, I'm not going to go into these a lot because we've already done these. And then finally, perceptual region is how people perceive an area to be. All righty. Now, when we talk about this idea of cultural landscape, and I mentioned this earlier in the video, when we think about cultural landscape, this is the visible reflection of a culture. So again, if you get put down in a place and you start to look around, what is the culture that you're seeing? Okay, the visualness of it. What can you pick up by the visual cues that gives you insight into what the culture is like? And so, this is going to be different. If you looked at the U.S., you're going to find a ton of different cultures within the U.S. based on the cultural landscape, because we can go to New York City, or we can go to rural South Carolina, or we can go to the Grand Canyon. I mean, these all reflect different cultural aspects of what the U.S. is. even though they can be very different within the country. Okay, and so just some of the examples here to show when we talk about cultural landscapes. So in the U.S., we have a national park system, and that shows that we have, a cultural belief of setting land aside for people to enjoy nature. All right, we can look at signage in different places if there are bilingual signs. I notice when I move down to Tucson, as you start to drive south on Interstate 9, I believe it is, the road mileage turns into meters and not or kilometers and not miles, and so that's something. There's definitely something there, and so you know by looking at things like signs, you can get an idea of what's going on. You can look at the schools and see what Give me a picture of a school, and I can kind of start to tell you a little bit about the culture. We can't draw huge conclusions, but we can start to get an idea. You can look at the office buildings. What does the city look like? Is it low? Is it tall? Things like that. And so here's just a couple of different pictures. And this tells a lot about culture in the United States leading up into the 1950s and 60s. And so these were the Jim Crow laws that there could be legal segregation between whites and blacks. But this tells us a lot. When we talk about the cultural landscape, if you came up on this and you see a white water fountain and it's this colored water fountain, if you see that, that can tell you a lot about what that culture's like. All right, this would be like a national park, showing that we this is something we value. All right, this would be an education system. If there's all girls in the school, that's telling us something. Here's a stop sign that's in two different languages. Here's a downtown area with all these tall buildings. That's telling us something as well. So when we talk about cultural landscape, it is the idea of being able to look at pictures and kind of using those pictures to develop a sense of culture or a sense of place. All right. Now, one place that this is easier to do is in these things that we call ethnic enclaves. And we talked about this a little bit, but ethnic enclaves are, and we have them in the U.S. They're all over the world. But when it's a group of people get together and have their own community within a larger community. All right, and so you might see like Chinatown. You can see here's a picture of Little Italy. And so when you go to bigger cities, you're going to see these areas in the city that reflect the ethnicity of different groups. All right, and so the question, why does this happen? Could be a couple of different parts. Could be that people feel that they want to stay away from a larger part of society. All right, they may feel that they have been segregated out of society, and this is a place to feel more comfortable. It may reflect the dominant culture's desire to segregate them. So there's a lot of different things, but you'll see things like different stores, religious institutions, different architecture in that area, and so you can tell relatively quickly if you are in an ethnic enclave or not. All right, but it does, and so take a look at this last one. It does or can provide a buffer from discrimination, because it's like, we'll stay here, you're over there. We feel a sense of safety in this area, and if it's a group that has been discriminated against, that makes sense. All right. So if we look at this picture, what does this tell us about the culture of the land? And so just a couple things here. Obviously, the architecture is different. Okay, that's a contrast there. You can see words written in English and words written in Chinese. And so you get the idea. Yeah, leave it at that. Now, also, again, this is all the spatial dimension of culture, looking at where cultures are different. We can start to see that sometimes borders do not create a good separation of culture. All right, and so living here in Tucson, we see that completely. We are a blend. We're a blend of Mexican culture and we're a blend of American culture. And so El Paso would be kind of the same thing. Nogales would be the same thing. And so, when we get to borders, that's where you start to see more of a transition or coming together of those two cultures. And so I want to show you this video that reflects a little bit of what that could be like. All right. And so you'll get the idea of it. And if you're struggling for time, you can kind of fast forward this, but I'm going to let it play through.
They want us to play Mexico?
Dad, a gig in Monterrey, Mexico,
Dad, that
man.
would be
That's big
so
time, dude.
cool.
I'm not sure of that right now.
Come on, Dad.
Hey, Dad, you always said everything's a risk, right?
They don't accept us with it. They never have.
Hello, we're Mexican.
No, we are Mexican American, and they don't like Mexican
That's
American.
all the same, going
and they can be
outside.
mean, and they can tear us apart over there.
Oh, it's
Selena's
right.
Spanish is.
What about my Spanish? I've been singing in Spanish for 10 years. It's perfect.
Singing, yes, but when you speak it a little funny. And down there, you gotta speak perfectly, or the press will eat you up and spit you out alive. I've seen them do it.
Overreacting as usual.
Dad, the music will speak for itself, Dad.
Listen, being Mexican American is tough. Anglos jump all over you if you don't speak English perfectly. Mexicans jump all over you if you don't speak Spanish perfectly. We've got to be twice as perfect as anybody else. Why are you laughing? What's so funny?
Nothing.
I'm serious.
I know
Our
you're
family
serious,
has
Dad.
been here for centuries, and yet they treat us as if we just swam across the Rio Grande. I mean, we gotta know about John Wayne and Pedro Infante. We gotta know about Frank Sinatra and Agustin Lara. We gotta know about Oprah and Christina. Anglo food is too bland, and yet when we go to Mexico, we get the runs. Now that, to me, is
Oh,
embarrassing.
Dad!
Japanese Americans, Italian Americans, German Americans, their homeland is on the other side of the ocean. Ours is right next door, right over there. And we gotta prove to the Mexicans how Mexican we are, and we gotta prove to the Americans how American we are. We gotta be more Mexican than the Mexicans and more American than the Americans, both at the same time. It's exhausting. Man, nobody knows how tough it is to be a Mexican American.
Well, Dad, you know, it's a good thing we have frijoles and tortillas to keep our strength up for the job.
Now you're making
No, I'm not. A menudo.
Hey, menudo, hey.
Menudo.
now you're making me hungry.
Come on, Dad. I can do it. I know I can. Really.
Trust us.
Listen, guys, let's get through with the tour in California, and then we'll talk about it.
All righty, so you get the idea. When we talk about different borders, that definitely creates a combination of two different cultures, which there was an interesting reflection on what it might be like for somebody to have both of those. And so, anyway, so again, we're looking at this broader overview of land use and spatial analysis of culture. Obviously, agricultural and industrial practices differ greatly. This is, obviously two very different ways of farming. And again, I would argue that this is not necessarily by choice. It's not like this person is saying, hey, I don't want to use a tractor. This is just saying, and like I was trying to refer to earlier, the culture that's there oftentimes can reflect the scarcity of what might be in that place. All right. And so this person, I'm sure, would enjoy being able to farm with a tractor like that, but there's a scarcity of that kind of machinery where they're at. And you can see here, this is just, this reflects a lot about our culture. So different farming techniques as well. This is the slash and burn going into a forest. This is how some land is cleared in different parts of the world. So anyway, different industrial practices. This is, car building. So you can see this is an automobile plant. I'm not sure where it is, but they're all pretty similar to this. Big machines. You don't see a whole lot of people here. This would be manufacturing of clothing, and you can see a lot of people here. And so again, lots of automation here, and not a whole lot over here. Very labor intensive. All right. Religious buildings also, again, if we're just examining a landscape, obviously different religions have different architecture for their buildings. And so you can see here we have a church, a temple, a mosque, a shrine, and then the pyramids. All right. We also have linguistic differences between places, and that's another way that we can kind of pick up on culture. This is one that you've heard me say a lot, and I'll probably continue to say it just because it's burned in pretty deep in my brain. But how do different people say you guys, you, y'all, or you all. And so you can kind of get a sense, if you're in this area, it's always y'all. Okay. And so out here, people generally say you guys. So I apologize, but y'all will hear me saying that a lot. Now, the other kind of bigger dimension here when we're talking about cultural regions is this term called a cultural realm. And so you can see here's the world broken up into these cultural realms. And so the idea is that cultures within these realms, and so obviously, the cultures are going to differ within the realms, within these areas, but a cultural realm is when they have a few things in common, that they all share the same thing. And it could be language, it could be religion, it could be food preferences or architecture, whatever kind of shared history they might have. And so when we talk about a cultural realm, it is, there is a commonality in that group. Okay, they're all not the same necessarily. Obviously, cultures differ within those areas, but there is something there that is similar. Okay. Now, the other thing that we'll talk about is this term. You'll see this. It's called sequent occupancy. And so sequent occupancy just says, if you look at a cultural landscape and you can see that other cultures were there beforehand, okay, that's what sequent occupancy is. It's when one group was there, they move out, another group comes in, and they build on and they add to what was already there. And so if you can go to a place and see, older artifacts, then you can get a sense of what sequent occupancy is. So, down here at the bottom it says layers of imprints in a cultural landscape that reflect years of differing human activity. And so, again, being able to go to a place and be able to look at that place and see, okay, wow, there was something here 500 years ago, and that's kind of still there. And then there was something, from 200 years ago, and that's still there. That's what we're talking about. All right. And we also want to look, if we're looking at a cultural landscape and how that might shape the use of a space, we want to look at the role of women, obviously, people's attitudes toward ethnicity and gender, indigenous communities. So we'll just run through this real quick. This is a woman's mobility scale, how free are women to walk around. In the green, women have full freedom. In the red down here, there are government laws to regulate women's movement. And then we get to the middle here, yellow, they would need permission from their family to enter public spaces. And so do you think that this has an impact on the cultural landscape, the things that you physically see? When places are laid out, is this the kind of thing that influences it? Here's female labor force participation rates. Obviously, the darker is higher labor participation. Would that influence the cultural landscape? All right. Here are ethnic neighborhoods. This is in Chicago. So you can see the blue here is Black or African American, and the green is Hispanic or Latino. The red is Asian. And so you can kind of get a sense of, these are more ethnic neighborhoods than not. All right. And so as we move away from the city, that starts to spread out. But within the city, definitely. This is a map of American Indian and Alaskan Native populations. This is our indigenous communities. And so you can see very small over here, obviously. And then when we move out west, we start to see these indigenous communities, the native populations, where they are. And does that have an impact on the cultural landscape? Because that's kind of what we're going for here. All right. How the city uses their land. This is Central Park in New York. What does this picture tell you about the people in New York? Does it give you any insights? Obviously, this is showing economic power with all these buildings, but the fact that they've carved out this spot for Central Park, how does that reflect the values of the people there, the culture of the people there? All right. Now, globalization. You know what? Let's see. Hang on just a sec. Let me pause this. Okay, so there's 10 more slides that I want to get to in this one, and then we'll be done. So when we talk about cultural change, and obviously this is going to be more pop culture, globalization has had a big impact. And again, we've talked about globalization before. It is this process of increased interactions among people around the globe, among governments, among companies, and it is shrinking the world. Remember that idea of time-space compression. This is what globalization has brought to us. And so obviously pop culture changes a lot. Oops, I should be doing this like that. Pop culture changes a lot because of globalization. So you can kind of see over here, here's, anime, Attack on Titan, I believe that is. And so, it does spread through the new technology with media, specifically the internet. The internet has done a lot for good and for bad, but it's done a lot to change cultures and spread cultures to parts of the world that never would have known about it before. All right, so this is one of the examples that of how popular culture can flash around the world pretty quick. I'm not going to play this whole thing, but you'll get the idea. Oh, I'm not going to play it at all. So that was Psy. Let's see if the next one will play. So that was the video for Gangnam Style. And again, without the internet, we probably would never have heard of him in America. I might be wrong, but the chances are lower for sure. Here's one that I just got introduced to, and unfortunately,
this may be exactly what they need here. The baby shark is going to pinch hit.
That really is amazing.
Talk about the spreading of culture and how fast it can spread. This is it. We'll turn it up so I can get it stuck in your head. A little backstory. This guy had baseball players, if you're not familiar, when they come up to bat, baseball players have a song that plays, and he had a little daughter. He's got a little daughter. This is her favorite song, so he changed it to us. But this is how culture spreads.
Fans have been waiting for 2 games for
so anyway, we don't have to watch the whole thing. All right. Again, we talked about space-time compression. This is the thing that has caused things to change a bunch, and culture to spread super fast now. Think about this. So if you're familiar with the Arab Spring, this was happened in 2012, 2011, thereabouts. This looks like 2011. And so the Arab Spring was a movement in the Middle East that to where people started to rise up against the governments that they felt were oppressive. And Egypt was one of the big ones. And so when we talk about the Arab Spring, one of the things that made it possible was social media. And as this guy puts it, we use Facebook to schedule the protests, Twitter to coordinate, and YouTube to tell the world. And so by using social media, they were quickly able to change lots of things. They changed their government. They changed the culture. And so, not to say that everything's completely different in Egypt now, because that the Arab Spring in Egypt, they've got a new set of problems. But some countries were able to change, and Syria, the civil war in Syria was sparked by the Arab Spring as well. And so, but anyway, I just wanted to see that social media can be used in a lot of different ways, and it was used in a big way in revolutions. And that's pretty incredible. Also, with globalization, we do see this changing role of gender. In folk cultures, women had very defined roles, whereas today the roles of women can be very different. If you look around the world, women have all different types of jobs. If you look at this, which countries have had a female leader? There's a bunch. There's still a lot that haven't, but there are more and more. How about that? We have our first female vice president elect at this point. So And I think I saw a report in the last election in 2020 in the U.S. There's now more women serving in Congress, which is the House and the Senate, than ever before. And so we are starting to see these gender roles change. All right. And again, we looked at this cartoon already, but this is the gender attitudes. And as culture spreads, you do start to see this clash of which gender roles are more accepted by culture versus not. All right, now there is some resistance to globalization, obviously for different reasons. Sometimes it's those cultural clashes that could show the changing role of women. If you look at the U.S., you know, when we talk about globalization, that means jobs start to flow overseas as well. And so if you are a worker in the U.S., you may have a strong resistance to globalization because this is the thing that is taking your job. Because if you're earning $13 an hour doing something, and somewhere in another part of the world somebody can do that for $2 an hour, your job may disappear. And so there is this resistance to globalization for certain people. If you speakers of endangered languages, they would resist the spread of globalization because it does harm their keeping their language going. Sorry, that was poorly worded. But because, you know, if you look at the language that's spoken on the internet, English has become kind of the de facto language. There's a term for that we'll use in the next video. But anyway, and this is the last bit. Is this a clash of cultures? This is an interesting picture because obviously they have a very strong similarity. They both love the sport, but their dress is obviously very different. So is this a clash of cultures, and is this something that we can live with? You know, and obviously they're playing this game and they're living with it quite well. So anyway, all right, that's it for this one. Sorry for the length of it. So anyway, y'all have a great day.